Right, we'll try that again. Batteries running low. I'm actually using some batteries that came out of another piece of kit. There we go. So there we go. That's a Zelda game. That's in. They can just see in there. Again, it's kind of hard to get the shots right. There's no backlight on these. That's closer on 6. That's more 16-bit color than 8-bit color, so it's obviously more advanced. So that was there. So that was the Game Boy Advance that Nintendo brought out. Now, obviously, going from the Game Boy Advance, one of the main complaints was it was very boxy. It was sorry, not very boxy. It was very the elongated build wasn't right. Wasn't what people expected. Obviously, they had been used to the original Game Boys having the buttons at the bottom. Some people said they didn't like this new design. Other people said they wanted a backlight, and varying companies offered the ability to install backlight units into the back of your Game Boy Advance. Did mean the batteries got drained. Did mean that you're much quicker and you didn't have as much playability out of the unit. But it gave you the option to have backlight. But it was a hack. It was a modification. It wasn't the standard Nintendo feature. If you wanted a backlight on if you wanted a light on your Game Boy Advance that was allowed by Nintendo, you'd have to buy a third-party backlight. Things like the worm light that would plug into the expansion port and power that. So to answer all those complaints Nintendo got, they came out, I'm sure as you know, came out with this, the Game Boy Advance SP. The unit, obviously clamshell, so you can keep it nice and safe. Opens up, same size screen as the Advance, much smaller unit when closed. D-pad, BA button, select start, speaker in the middle. You've got a power switch there, you've got the L and R buttons. This actually has a rechargeable battery, so as well as the expansion port, you've also got the charger port there. Games went in the bottom. You've got the volume control over here, and the unit was had backlight and all things like that. So you've got a backlight button there, turn it off. Later versions of the SP actually had an improved screen and actually had multiple backlight levels, so you could have 2 different levels of backlight and things like that. But again, the hardware was pretty much the same as the standard GBA. It would play all your original Game Boy games. They would fit in there, and again they would have the stretching by using the L and R buttons to stretch the image across the wide screen. There you go. You can see quite better now. Much better now. I can zoom in there. There we go. You can see the level of colour on the game there. Obviously you also had a charger indicator and a power indicator. Obviously power is green because of I have full power on, the unit's fully charged. So of course that was the Game Boy Color and Game Boy Play. This was a Game Boy only game. Game Boy Color only game. And we can stretch that across to the full screen. It's not really a good example of how improved the colours are, but there were definitely wider colour palette able to be used on the Game Boy Color only games. Again, there's the backlight we turned on and off on this one. Obviously in others you could get different levels, and then obviously Game Boy Advance only games sat nicely. Nice Game Boy Advance startup logo sound. And there you go. As you can see much better that it's a 16-bit. Looks more like the SNES rather than the NES. So that's there. Now, the SP was replaced in 2 parts actually. Nintendo first of all came out with the Nintendo DS, which was not a Game Boy. It was a separate. It was a separate product. It was designed to be used. I'll zoom back out. It was designed to offer a new type of game, but it also obviously offered the ability to use Game Boy Advance games. So a lot of people replaced their original Game Boys Advances. They weren't going to do multiplayer with the DS. Now the DS obviously is that clamshell design again. Got 2 screens. Play screen, touch screen, power button, D-pad. You've got 4 buttons. You actually got the same button mapping as the Super Nintendo, so you've got the X and Y and BA, select start. Got the shoulder button still. you've got the cartridge slot for the Nintendo DS cartridges, which are these. You see they're they're more like just normal memory cards than the actual cartridges you would get with the original Game Boy Advance. Obviously they slot in the top there. It actually used the same charger port as the Game Boy Advance SP. On the bottom you had the volume control, headphone jack, and there's also a port for the microphone on a headphone, and it had a microphone built into it. Had Wi-Fi, it's got Wi-Fi, all that sort of stuff. At the bottom here you have the slot for the Game Boy Advance games. Sorry, I just buy that quickly. So stick those in there. Power on. Obviously it also had the stylus because it was a touchscreen unit. Just make sure that's sitting straight. So had the DS sound with its own screen. You had on-off backlight. You had the little menu for being able to do things like download games from friends who have that sort of feature. Had games that had download play features, pick to chat, but obviously you could start Game Boy Advance game, and you could also pick which screen you wanted your GBA screen to be launched. I went for the top, always because of it matches the SP, which is just how an original Game Boys. So there you go. So there's the original Game Boy Advance game on there. Now the DS could not play any Game Boy games. They don't fit in the cartridge. There's actually marking. I don't know if I show you. There's actually a moulding difference on the cartridges for the Game Boy Advance and the Game Boy. I can just see there's those little corners taken out there, and on the Game Boy Color, just line them up, it's all squared off. That meant that you can't stick your Game Boy games into your DS. You can only stick in Game Boy Advance games to use those. Obviously the other thing the DS had was its own games, which has been obviously much better games, well, much better graphical games and more features, and use touchscreen, things like that, and you could launch those, and those operated using both screens, as I'm sure you all know, offer much better graphics. So there you go, you can just see that's more on par with the N64 than the Super Nintendo, which is where the original Game Boy Advance was going. So we'll turn that off. Now, at the same time that they released the DS, Nintendo also decided to resize the Game Boy Advance again, and they introduced the Game Boy Micro, Game Boy Advance Micro. I don't have one to show you. However, basically it was a very, very small Game Boy Advance. It actually lost the ability to play original Game Boy games and could only play Game Boy Advance games. So you obviously, you could only play the latest games for Game Boy Advance rather than the original ones. However, obviously, I went for the DS and went down that line to play the new games as well as my original Game Boy Advance games. Now, obviously, as we know, the DS was considered a bit ugly when it was compared to its competitor, the Sony PlayStation Portable, PSP. So Nintendo took the original DS and retooled it and brought out the Game Boy Lite, which is still on sale today. I know they're gradually trying to phase it out with replacements with things like the newer consoles, especially with the 3DS on the way. Light, nice glossy finish, still got the Game Boy Advance port. It's actually shorter, so when you stick a Game Boy Advance game, it actually sticks out. But with this, they actually gave you a cover. This is actually the Rumble Pack, but for the DS games. But as you can see there, it's a lot shorter than the Advance games, so they do stick out when you stick them in. Layout is pretty much the same. You've got the volume control at the bottom, microphone jack and headphone jack. You've got a microphone built in there, 2 touch screens, select start with by the same buttons. The charging unit is different.